Well, on behalf of the Australian Compassion Council, I warmly welcome you all to this webinar with Chloë Spackman, CEO of Next25. Next25 is an independent think and do tank whose mission is to ensure that Australia has what it takes to make the future people want. This session forms part of the 2024 National Day of Compassion, a day which contributes to the work of Australia's Compassion Council's overall aim of deep dreaming Australia a continent for compassion. My name is Lynne Reader, and I'm the National Lead of the Australian Compassion Council, and I'm very pleased today to be speaking with Chloë about deep connection in contested spaces. I feel this is a really important topic because today's fractured political discourse challenges us to recognise how our emotional triggers interfere with our capacity to hear others. This was particularly so, as we know, last year with the Voice referendum and Next25's report, Contested Spaces, Australia, the Referendum and Constructive Discussion, sought to examine how we can better engage with complex policy issues. As I mentioned, Chloë is the CEO of Next25, and she has a decade of experience in program design, delivery, evaluation, focusing on leadership and global citizenship, innovation and social impact. Prior to becoming Next25's inaugural CEO, Chloë was the program director, and in that role, she led the development of the program Leadership, Improving Democracy, Transforming Parliament for Women and 21st Century Service. So welcome, Chloë.
Thank you, Lynne, for the introduction and for your interest and support of Next25's work and for inviting me to contribute to the National Day of Compassion.
Excellent. So I suppose if we can just set the context, for how constructive dialogue can assist in attaining deep connection in contested spaces. I'm just wondering if we can first unpack what a contested space is and specifically how describing that space as it applies within your recent study on the Indigenous voice referendum.
Yeah, perfect. So in simple terms, a contested space refers to either physical spaces or topic areas where there are various ingrained socio-cultural meanings attached, and they've become a battleground for various interests, competing values or beliefs, or for differing outcomes. So in Next25 language, our research found that if we could become better at constructively discussing complex and contested issues, despite our varied experiences and perspectives, this would be a major opportunity to improve Australia's performance towards a flourishing future. So in this context, we're really talking about the national conversation on issues of great importance to our collective future. But we're referring to all the levels at which that conversation takes place. So cultural, institutional, political, relational, and personal. So for Australia, the 2023 referendum, which was about enshrining an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice into our constitution, was very important and historical. And there's a long, complex, fraught history and current reality to confront for Australia as a nation, for all people of Australia. There was a deep division, deep sensitivity, and undeniably salient consequences, no matter what the result was, a yes or a no. So a very contested space. And last year with the impending referendum, we were curious to find out what were the barriers and enablers the people in Australia encountered when they were discussing the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. So in short, how well are we talking about national issues? How healthy is the national conversation, regardless of what the particular outcome is? So our 2023 report, which you mentioned, Contested Spaces, Australia, the Referendum and Constructive Discussion, offers insight into those key barriers and enabling factors based on interviews with people who have professional experience with productive and unproductive conversations and have worked across a diverse range of industries. We also actually have a more recent study, which we collaborated on with the University of Technology's Transdisciplinary School into constructive discussion through the prism of the Sydney Housing Challenge. So another very contested space. And in that context, the contested space refers to significant differences in opinions, values, or interests among stakeholders in the housing system, leading to conflict or strident debate. So in the Sydney housing case study, what we found is that the contested spaces centred around divergent aims or visions. So, for example, housing as an asset class versus housing as a social right, as well as the technical elements to achieve either of those aims. So the study highlighted that while the narrative is shifting, housing in Sydney has historically and continues to be governed by a policy discourse that prioritises homes as tools for private wealth creation rather than as essential social good, leading to tensions and conflicts over how housing should be governed and who should benefit. So another contested space in our national conversation. One thing that we've found across our research is that when it comes to the reality of the modern society we live in, the echo chambers, the identity politics, the social media dissonance, the influence of social media algorithms, we're up against a lot of interconnecting and mutually reinforcing challenges when it comes to addressing challenges that are so critical for our nation to address and work through in these highly contested spaces. So they are complex and contested spaces to begin with. And then we have this added layer of complexity in the way we construct and have conversations, or don't have them, as it may be, in contemporary society. Mis and disinformation, the media, the algorithms, they fan the flames of this polarization or perpetuate this post-truth, post-reality politics where all facts are disputable. And this really challenges the public's ability to connect with any sense of shared reality, regardless of what one's opinion on that reality is. And it's interesting, I just read the other day a 2022 study from the Department of Psychology at Columbia University, which demonstrated how a sense of shared reality can actually calm people down, especially around stressful or high stakes events like the 2023 referendum. So social validation during co-experienced stresses reduces reactivity. We don't want reactivity when we're trying to make progress on really challenging, important issues. We want creativity and vision. And creativity needs self-awareness and it needs calm.
Yeah. Well, certainly your study found that the capacity to sit with uncertainty is so important, you know, in, as you say, being able to bring people to these constructive conversations. So how can everyday Australians be encouraged to sit with discomfort, and how does practicing reflexive thought help them in dealing with that uncertainty? They're not easy, you know, they're quite big things to ask of people.
Yeah, it's so important. Our research in the lead up to the referendum highlighted this reality that sitting with uncertainty is crucial in constructive discussions, especially in complex and contested spaces. And the study found that there was this distinct lack of safe spaces for exchange. So one of our key findings was that interviewees found that discomfort and confrontation are necessary. So a lot of what came up points to this perception that having constructive conversations about contested issues like the voice is going to be uncomfortable, confronting, and can lack compromise, particularly in this current hyperpolarized environment. And even if none of that is actually the case in practice, the perception is that it will be. So for some research participants, this friction is a necessary part of democracy, but far more people felt that disrespect and aggression are not needed for robust constructive discussions, as it typically leads to less people having the space and opportunity to contribute and for the conversation to actually get somewhere. So one interviewee posed the question, are we just afraid to publicly argue these days? It seems as though there's these polarized responses to challenging discussion to go alongside the polarized opinions. So where conversation is either aggressive and highly divisive, or it's highly restrained and polite, and we get the dismissive agree to disagree. So this is a direct quote from a research participant who said, developing the skill and building the muscle rather than just sitting around and, oh yes, we've had a nice conversation and we've agreed to disagree. that doesn't actually get us anywhere. So the problem with agree to disagree is that it shuts down the opportunity for possibility, for progress, and for emergence. It's just a complete sweeping under the carpet. And as the participant said, that's not constructive discussion. So we need to be able to sit with discomfort if we're going to create spaces for connection. And I think it's a good moment to reflect on what we mean by constructive discussion. So there's obviously no one shared understanding, but as a result of sense making through our research and engagement, we offer this working definition. So consensus is not the focus of constructive discussion. Rather, it's about the process of being heard and affording others the time and space to express themselves. The aim is that people have the space and opportunity to share perspectives and explore difference. If we let go of the idea that constructive discussion is about getting everyone to agree or having everyone agree with us, and instead have the intention or outcome we seek as being to hear and to be heard, then we're reframing the way we engage, and it can be easier to sit with the discomfort that arises because we want to hear. We have the intention of listening deeply and considering how the way we're showing up in the conversation is affecting how constructive it is or isn't. So that's where the practice of the reflexive thought comes in. And this really requires courage. So in our workshops with MPs, so we have a few programs that we work on restoring trust in government with MPs from across the political spectrum. And we do them in partnership with an organisation called Corporate Evolution. But we talk about being on the balcony and in the dance. And this is, in fact, a key skill we introduce in our workshops with MPs. And it's essentially practicing reflexivity. So being part of the action or the dance, or in this case, the conversation, and simultaneously being able to consider with curiosity the experience and motivations driving the person you're conversing with, and then considering the same of yourself. So what assumptions are you both bringing to the conversation? And that's the being on the balcony part. So it's not about getting people to discuss things on our terms, but about purposefully and intentionally guiding and refocusing conversations to unpack what it is the other person is trying to communicate, and then consider how we might respond in a way that actually meaningfully progresses that conversation. In our programs, we also call on tools like Otto Scharmer's 4 levels of listening and speaking, which help us to set up the enabling conditions for genuine exchange. So, you know, the old adage, listening isn't thinking about what you will say next. It's about being conscious of the intention you bring to the conversation. It's self-awareness and self-management. And as I mentioned before, how do you step out of that reactive mind and into the creative mind?
But people have got to come, don't they, ready? Like, as you say, it requires courage, but it also requires a willingness to, engage in that level of self-awareness. And often these things are about holding a position because that's where I'm safe, where I know, which is, how the world works. That's where I'm safe. So I'm just thinking about the levels of trust and how that can also lead to more constructive conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. So we explored a lot of that in our research, and the Australian government's website about the referendum on the voice said to be ready for the conversation, but as I've already mentioned, our research discovered that despite that intent, most people experience confusion, apathy, and bias, and were acutely aware of subjective echo chambers. So one of our key findings was around the media's role in this, so that the media fuels and reflects. So the media is understood as the source, but also as the disseminator of polarized discussion. So interviewees reflected on how the media has created an arena of heightened conflict and superficial coverage. And this is further complicated by people's bite-sized consumption habits, which people seemed very well aware of, but unsure how to combat the impact of. So how to combat the influence mainstream media has on shaping the national agendas and people's opinions because of these practices of 24/7, bite-sized, rapidly moving pieces of information that are lacking nuance and are so widespread and so relentless. So interviewees reflected that while they view this as happening at or being led at an institutional level, you know, the institution of the media, it was actually having a filter down effect on how we spoke to one another. So on a one-on-one or in small conversation. So we're carrying all that media dictated or role modeled speed and pressure, and we're placing the same rules and immediacy on our own personal conversations. And the impact this has is, you know, heightening all of the confusion that already exists. So our research indicates that in this way, the confusion is both a symptom and a cause of the poor quality of our discussions. And this really pointed to the need to create specific fora where we can establish trust and practice our listening skills and that reflective thought that I just spoke about before. And there's a lot of cynicism about our ability to create safe and trusting spaces. And with everything I've just mentioned from our research, you can absolutely see why, which is why I really do like sharing what happens in our work with MPs, because I think you'd be hard pressed to think of a place that's more challenged by polarization and a lack of constructive discussion and influenced by media, which we just discussed, than politics. But that is actually where we're working. And of course, we want robust debate in our parliaments, in our democracy, but we want it to be about the things that really matter and not about attacking or tearing down individuals in a way that provides media fodder and distraction from the truly complex challenges we face and would be unacceptable in any other contemporary workplace. But the institution of politics, the system of it is very resilient. So off the back of the federal Jenkins report and the New South Wales Broderick report, and I think every parliament in Australia has had some kind of review into toxic workplace cultures, we worked with 4 New South Wales women MPs, so 1 Labor, 1 Liberal, 1 Green and 1 Independent, to create an initiative called Improving Democracy, Transforming New South Wales Parliament for Women. And we now have nearing 30% of women in New South Wales Parliament as alumni of the program. So women from right across the political spectrum, and every single one has chosen to continue to be part of what they have self-named the collective, working together to transform New South Wales Parliament for the participation and flourishing of women. So we meet with them regularly and provide a safe and trusting space and process for them to work on the prototypes that they've co-designed, so various ways to transform Parliament. But most importantly, all their relationships have been transformed. And that has already had an incredible effect on the experience of Parliament for those women and for those around them too. So this is an example of a highly ideologically divided community with often very competing priorities coming together to constructively discuss and make progress on a collective purpose for the greater good. And when I first meet with these women MPs in the preparatory calls, I explain that it is partly about transforming self in order to transform the system. So I've seen how we can impact and transform systems through the just conversations that we have. And I think the uniting part is identifying the shared values and identifying the shared vision. So they obviously have other values and visions that, play out through their parties, their ideologies, their other affiliations, but there was identifying a shared vision for the future, which was having Parliament flourish, having Parliament be a place where women can flourish. And so I think that's a way to connect people, is really finding, well, where are our shared values and what is a vision for the future that is enough to unite us and bring us together to have spaces for these conversations.
Yeah. And I think too, so that sort of sense of finding common humanity first, and then, the differences, but that starting from that space of where we where we're the same, where we're connected, have the same, aims and values, or not necessarily values, but, wishes for the future, then that's, a good starting point. And then from there, to manage the differences. So, so that's great to do it internally. Then externally, I was, part of the report that you wrote was like that we swing between, fighting for a side. It's almost like personal, so it's my team. So between fighting for a side or not being interested at all, or throw it all away. So I'm just wondering again how some of the internal lessons that you've learned can apply, in engaging people externally as well.
Yes. So I guess if you take the example I just spoke about with women coming together across the political divide, you can see again that overcoming apathy to have connected, constructive conversation is enabled by creating that shared sense of purpose. So in this case, as I mentioned, wanting all women to flourish in Parliament. The research we've done on the Sydney Housing Challenge suggests reorienting the discourse to focus on a shared vision of what we understand the purpose of housing to be for all Australians. So that could be a great way to motivate broader engagement and pull people out of their corners. So again, I think there are shared values. I think it's the beliefs we attach to the values is where we get into murkier water, or people disagree because we all have constructed different beliefs that we attach to the values. But I think this is about having a national conversation where we can say what is important to us as a nation. And we do have a research project called Navigator, which is all about understanding what is the future Australia wants, and are we on track to that future? So we do that through a representative sample of Australians and dig into where is there a lot of commonality or, a high degree of shared vision for the future. And I think that's a great place to start by highlighting that, because we can discuss that if we can agree that there are some things we want for a flourishing future. That's a great starting point. And then I think we need the fora to have those conversations in a different way to how we're having them. So there needs to be some recognition of the media or social media or online is not going to be the way is not always going to be the way to create the space for those conversations.
Yes, yeah, for sure. And I'm just wondering then, that contested spaces, we're wanting to sort of bring people into them and have them support, but and be supported in those spaces. But I also wonder whether contested spaces can be spaces for dissent as well, and exchange of alternate ideas.
Yes, absolutely. Contested spaces can indeed be spaces for dissent and exchange of alternate ideas. In fact, contested spaces are the precise spaces where we should be creating the conditions for and learning how to have constructive discussions with those that may disagree with us. So going back to our working definition of constructive discussion, consensus is not the focus of constructive discussion. Rather, it's about the process of being heard and affording others the time and space to express themselves. And I'll read this direct quote from our most recent paper on constructive discussion in the Housing Challenge, because it gets to this point about dissent or having different views. So constructive discussion involves a pragmatic recognition that many complex decisions are not possible through consensus and are not devoid of argument or conflict. As such, it connects decision-making to forms of discussion that accept diverse viewpoints and disagreement as useful and important for decisions to be appropriate and normative. So the constructive aspect of constructive discussion sees that these exchanges must lead somewhere purposeful or productive. So constructive discussion is not discussion for discussion's sake, but instead points to discussions that are functional, helping society to move forward and make decisions in the interests of the long-term common good. So we're framing dissent as a necessary component of constructive dialogue. And contested spaces are therefore the perfect arenas for meaningful exchanges that challenge the status quo and push for progress, for emergence, and for possibility.
Fantastic. Yeah. Oh, thank you so much, Chloë. Was there any last messages or any issues that you wanted to raise that we haven't covered so far?
Maybe just given that this is the National
Yes,
for the
sure.
National Day of Compassion,
Yeah, sure.
I think the research that we've done certainly points to this, but also my experience in the workshops we've done across various elements of our work. And as you know, our work and the system we look at is broad. I think that compassion is such a key tool in being able to do everything that I've just been speaking about with you now, and that it has to start with a bit of compassion for self. I think it's hard to be compassionate with others if we can't be compassionate for ourselves. And so I very much appreciate being able to have this conversation with you for the National Day of Compassion, and appreciate how important this work is.
Good. Oh, thank you so much. Yes, well, I know when you talk about courage, Professor Paul Gilbert from the UK Compassionate Mind Foundation, you know, says that compassion and wisdom are just such important components. Courage and wisdom are such important components of compassion, and this notion of really being able to connect with other people takes a lot of courage. He says one of his definitions is compassion is the courage to descend into the reality of the human experience, wherever that is. And we know that that can take us in all sorts of directions, and that there's a lot of wisdom in connecting with the suffering of people. Again, Paul says, not because we're suffering, but because other people are suffering. So it's that very generous component of it as well. So thank you so much. I think, for me, the takeaway lesson, is that it's so important that we learn how to argue, that we bring ourselves to the engagements that we have, and how we can negotiate difference, so that we can make the space to talk about the key issues that have affected us in the past, and certainly will continue to do so in the future. So this has been an inspiring conversation, and one that has made an important contribution to the 2024 National Day of Compassion. Thank you, Chloë.
Thank you, Lynne.